in which business lose its almost inevitable. When the businesses lose, clearly labor also is. After all, it is important that business employs people. As the business employs more people, definitely we will be able to carry
On my camera, my sound.
Logically, it is fundamental in labor business interest that the metal and engineering sector is successful and internationally development.
But in order to be able to starve of imports to compete for the export market. When negotiation begins, it is vitally important that all stakeholders are realistic in their expectations, fully mindful of the fact that South Africa is not an island unto its own. Almost everything we manufacture in South Africa as the metal and engineering sector, it is also manufactured abroad, and competitors from China, India, and other Asian countries, and even Europe stand knocking on our borders, ready to drive us out of existence, and in the process to take jobs away from South Africans. The past few years have been tough for metals and engineering industries, and indeed for the rest of the economy, which has not grown at the rate at which we would have wanted it to grow in order to create more jobs in the country, and in our sector in particular. We accept that the negotiations will unfold, will not be easy. We understand that they will be tough, with both employers and the trade unions putting their demands on the table. It is our hope, however, that all bargaining partners will approach the negotiation table in a mature and constructive manner, with the interest of the country and in particular of the metals and engineering sector in mind. We as an office of the MEIBC therefore appeal for a win-win approach to the negotiations and to all negotiating partners, and trust that all of you will use your best endeavors and put the interest of the metals and engineering sector first, and indeed in so doing, the interest of our beautiful country first. We are therefore looking forward to an interesting, insightful, and engaging pre-bargaining conference. Program Director, with those few words, I want to thank you.
Thank you so much, GS. You took exactly 7 minutes. We appreciate that. Just a few housekeeping arrangements and a slight adjustment on the agenda. We appeal to all those who are recording the proceedings to make sure that you do it swiftly so that we don't get feedback. That's number one. And number two, also, Nuran, to welcome all the online participants on the program. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I believe the bar rooms are at two locations in relative to this room. They are straight past the stairs on the right. And then another set is to the right, and then right on the passage that goes along that wall. I'm not sure from the staff of the venue if there's anybody that has been assigned to do a safety moment, but I know that we are not very far from the stairs that go out of the building. So if anything happens, I'll just advise you to just run downstairs. And then I see that between now and lunch is just a marathon. Is it okay if I then propose a 5-minute leg stretcher between the slot of the General Secretary of NUMSA and the General Secretary of Gideon Du Plessis? Just a 5-minute leg stretch at that time, if the House agrees. With that said, ladies and gentlemen, allow me then to call upon the President of the Council, Mr. Daniel van der Merwe, to come and address the meeting. Thank you so much. Give him a big hand of applause.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen, everyone online, esteemed guests. I'd just like to acknowledge the work done by the Office of the MEIVC to arrange this. I know when we had our MANCO a little while ago, we dumped this on the GS and I could see his eyes get quite big. So thank you for what's been done. I want to acknowledge the Deputy President as well, Victor. I know during the last year as well, he's definitely provided me with a lot of guidance and a lot of assistance. So just welcome to everyone and thank you very much. For those who don't know me, my name is Daniel van der Merwe, the President of the MEIVC at the moment. I'm also the National Collective Bargaining Coordinator at CEO. Today I stand honored to stand before you today to delve into the nuanced and critical aspects of the pre-bargaining conference of the MEIVC. As we embark on this journey, it's imperative to thoroughly understand the comprehensive overview and multifaceted objectives of this crucial event, recognizing its profound impact on the industry, the industrial relations, and the well-being of the workforce and employers in our nation. Before delving into the specifics of the pre-bargaining conference, let's take a moment to grasp the significance of the MEIVC. This institution serves as the epicenter for negotiations between employers and trade unions within the metals and engineering sector. The agreements forged in these negotiations set the standards for wages, working conditions, terms and conditions, and other employment terms, thereby establishing the groundwork for a fair and just industrial landscape. As we understand the pre-bargaining conference for today, this conference emerges as a strategic catalyst, setting the tone for the formal negotiation process to follow. This collaborative forum serves as an incubator for ideas, concerns, and solutions, while simultaneously fostering an environment of proactive engagement. During the course of today, we will explore the multifaceted objectives that underpin this conference and its pivotal role in shaping the trajectory of industrial relations in South Africa. If we look at some of the key objectives for today, in no specific order, today is all about information sharing. Transparency is the cornerstone in effective negotiations. The pre-bargaining conference facilitates the exchange of vital information, data, and the concerns amongst the parties. This information sharing process lays the foundations for well-informed decision-making during the formal negotiation process. Secondly, today is about building relationships. Sustainable industrial relationships are built on trust, understanding, and collaboration between the parties. This conference serves as a unique opportunity for all of our stakeholders to build and strengthen relationships, transcending the bargaining table and creating an environment of open communication and cooperation. Thirdly, we address challenges today. Proactive problem solving is a hallmark of effective negotiations. This conference allows stakeholders to participate and to address potential challenges while simultaneously strategizing solutions to mitigate the risk of disruptions during the formal negotiation process. And lastly, something that we've already done is setting ground rules. We've done this through the process agreement as well as the draft on code of good practice during the picketing as well. If we look at the broader impact of today, beyond the immediate objectives of today, the pre-bargaining conference holds the potential to contribute to the broader societal and economic landscape. By fostering a climate of collaboration and understanding, we lay the groundwork for agreements that not only meet the immediate needs of stakeholders, but also contribute to the long-term prosperity and sustainability of the metals and engineering sector in South Africa. I know the GS was about 7 minutes. I'm usually quite short and to the point, so I'll be about 5 minutes in conclusion. So in conclusion, the pre-bargaining conference of the MEIBC is not just a procedural necessity. It is a strategic imperative that shapes the future of our industrial relations. As we navigate the intricacies of this conference, let us remain committed to the principles of fairness and mutual respect. Together we can forge a path towards agreements that not only address the immediate concerns of all stakeholders, but also contribute to the sustainable growth and prosperity of our nation. May our collective endeavors today and in the negotiations to come pave the way for a brighter and more equitable future for all stakeholders in the metals and engineering sector in South Africa. Thank you.
President, thank you so much. I don't know what's going to happen in Parliament tomorrow, but you were exactly 5 minutes compared to, I don't know what the president is, how long it's going to take tomorrow in Parliament. Thank you so much, President, for setting the tone for today's proceedings. I mentioned earlier that there's a slight adjustment on the agenda. We are now going to ask someone from the Rand Mutual Assurance, abbreviated RMA. As many of us will be aware in this room, that RMA is our, the President mentioned a strategic, that this event is a strategic catalyst to the negotiation process. But RMA is our strategic partner in the MEIBC in various ways that their speaker, Vivi Majova, is going to outline in front of us today. Can you please give her a big round of applause? Thank you so much.
Is it on? Good morning. Okay, I can even hear myself. Molweni bethu nani. Nguvuyiswa wakwaMajova ome phambi kwenu. NdinguMamntambo and ndithanda ukubulela enkosi Program Director, President GS, President, as well as the room at large. Really thankful and appreciate being afforded this opportunity as a key stakeholder, as previously mentioned, representing our organization, which is Rand Mutual Assurance. And mine is very quick. I think we've been asked to just come into this forum and really reestablish our partnership with MEIBC, but also broadly to just also highlight into the room the role that we play, but also humbly so, in a sense of being a key service provider into the metals industry. So I'm just going to be very brief and just talk around who we are as RMA, and I think you'll see outside we'll be sitting there, and we really encourage the room and the team around here to please come and engage with us, because we really do believe, Comrade GS, that as you're going into the market and bargaining, it's important to ensure that abasebenzi are fully covered, employee benefits are fully delivered, and that's what we do as Rand Mutual Assurance. We pride ourselves in that, and we really appreciate being a partner in that sense. So just very briefly, I think it's telling for the fact that we as RMA, we say ourselves, the reason for us for being is we are an organization that exists purely to deliver social security in the mining as well as the metals industry. And I think you'll see when I tell you the story. And I think ours is a story that's very much intertwined with the metals industry, because yes, we're an agency of the Compensation Fund, having been founded in 1894 by founding mining houses. So we predate the legislation of COIDA, as you would know it, and because we were founded at that time when the mining industry and the gold rush in South Africa was really in full steam. So we've been in the forefront of really making sure that we look after the workers. And in instances where workers do get befallen by an incident or an accident at work, we are there to make sure that we compensate. And I think very aptly when we talk about the metals industry, you'll see, sorry, I thought there was a pointer. You'll see, yes, we were born in 1894, and we went on, but in 2015 for us was quite a game changer, because as an agency of the fund, we were then given a license to operate in the metals industry. And us acquiring the metal class of business really changed our business, because what it did is it brought us in excess of 1.3 million lives that we as RMA are now accountable for, to make sure that if employees, abasebenzi, either contracted disease at work or they are unfortunately injured, we need to make sure that we compensate them appropriately. So metals to us is very important, because we look after 25,000 employers within the metals industry. So it is quite apt that we're here today, because we want to showcase the fact that we are your partner, and we are a partner just over and above just being a partner, but ensuring that social security is delivered for abasebenzi in South Africa. And I think it's important, Comrade President, to showcase that, you know, we as a business, we are a mutual. Yes, we do plan our business for 100% claims ratio. So all of the premiums that we collect on behalf of employers, we ensure that they are really looked after, and we invest them with a conscience to make sure that we're able to pay claims, because as a mutual, we are held into account. And I see comrade from Enum Sabakona or Victor, they sit on our board, because we've got representation for some of our organized labor that sits within our board, that make sure that whatever we do, what we stand for, we really live up to it. So for us as Rand Mutual, we're saying, as you go out into the market and make sure that employees and abasebenzi are looked after, you can also count on Rand Mutual as being that partner to deliver for that, because our reason for being is about that. And I think it's important, Comrade President, to show the fact that we don't just pay lip service. In the past 3 years as an organization, we were on a journey of redefining our purpose and redefining our values and reason for being. And I think it's important, comrades, as we're sitting, for me to just show you that, you know, we then came up with a purpose statement that really says, us as RMA, what is it that makes us wake up every morning? And I think it's a statement that should resonate with you today, because it says, we as RMA, we believe that workers are the heartbeat of the economy. We will make sure we enable their dreams, we will empower them, and we will restore their dignity. Because there's nothing more disheartening when Utata Wekhaya is now injured. He either loses a limb or ability to walk, and they can't then realize the dreams of their children. So it's incumbent on us as RMA to make sure that those dreams become realized. And you'll see the way that we compensate, the way that we rehabilitate, and the way that we try and prevent incidences with workers is really about that. And we don't just leave it at that. We also say ours is to pioneer unique value for money solutions. And these are solutions that talk to an employee's life journey, because I think we all know we're exposed to various risk incidences. So ours as RMA and the things that we do is about saying that all of those value for money and supporting products, we bring them to market. So ours is to say, lastly but not least, we as Rand Mutual, we exist to care and to serve with compassion in the metals and the mining industry. And I hope, Nizas, you'll hold us true to that, because this is who we are and what we say we do. And I think it's important, colleagues, for me to just also highlight to say, ultimately, we've got a very clear strategic journey that we've highlighted and charted as an organization. But that journey, the core of it all, given our purpose statement, is about we ultimately want to ensure that at the end of the day, every employee in mining and in metals has a better value proposition, because we bring to market better choice in terms of products, better benefits, value, and service. And how do we do this? We've been doing it for 130 years in the coid industry. So our value proposition is to say, at work, RMA is able to cover employees fully. But our strategy, we are now taking it beyond work. And I think those colleagues around the room who've worked with us, some of our products say, we understand COIDA covers an employee at work, but what happens when Vuyiswa is commuting from home to work, from one shaft to another operating plant? There are likely incidences. So when we talk about beyond work and at work, we are really about fully making sure that we look after the employees. And I think, Comrade President, one of the things we want to do is say, as employee benefits are being considered, please know that RMA is a solution for employees to be able to receive benefits. So we talk about this thing of RMA being a social insurer, and it is something that really is embedded in our DNA. Yes, our mandate is about us delivering on a constitutional mandate, because yes, we are covering a social insurance, which is based on premium collection from employers. So on the one hand, our social insurance outlook is about making sure that we fulfill on the constitutional mandate that we've been given. We don't leave it at that. We also have a very clear governance and accountability proposition. And as I mentioned, our board, we sit with key stakeholders that are in this room and are represented. So we're quite transparent and we're kept to task in terms of how we deliver what we need to do. Ultimately, we also need to make sure that there's a social value and a protection from employees. Because imagine, we've got employees who unfortunately get injured at the age of 30 or 35, and they're then labeled as a permanent disabled person. So ours is to make sure that that worker is looked after throughout their lives. And that's what COIDA enables us to do. So we make sure that the social net is covered. Thank you, Dad. And then we also work towards a public interest to making sure that we deliver appropriately, also delivering the social program director, you disturbed me right there. But I think where I want to move to then very quickly is mentioning the fact that, for us as RMA, we've got a very clear and a full suite of products that we deliver for employees. We are outside, please talk to us. We can also showcase what we're doing. But I think it's important, Comrade President, to also just say, with the MEIBC, we are partners, and we are partners to help the organization move forward. And I think it's important for me to just highlight that, we've been working with the team under the leadership of GS to say, MEIBC is looking to us as RMA to bring our capability to help the organization to start looking at getting into the fourth IR in terms of automation, modernizing your system, and also integrating the value proposition. So we are partners, not just sitting on the COID side, but we're also helping the business to go forward. So I think for us, there is a lot of data. We have shared this information with the team, but as Comrade Program Director has told me, I'm out of time. I just want to say, Remember, Rand Mutual is a partner with the metals industry, and we are so grateful that we are afforded this opportunity. And Comrade Prez, we wish you good luck with the bargaining and the process, and we will be around. Thank you so much. Enkosi.
So much, Vivi. Give her another round of applause. Thank you so much, Vivi. For the simple reason that I disturbed her to say that time was running out. Thank you so much. Now we are going to get to the session for presenters. I forgot my paper now. The session for presenters starting exactly at 10:30. The presenters will speak, then we will allow for an opportunity for questions. And then we want to restrict those questions strictly to only 3. And if you don't have an opportunity to speak and or ask a question, you will note that in the afternoon, there will be that discussion that is going to be closed. You still have an opportunity to make your input in there. Now we will be asking to come forward Mr. Tafadzwa, commonly referred to as Tafi Chibangunza. He is the Chief Operating Officer of SIFSA, the Steel and Engineering Industries of South Africa. Give him a big applause, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Program Director. This one, okay, thanks. Thank you, Program Director, and good morning to everyone in the room, to the leadership of both NUMSA and the business federations represented here, as well as the other unions as well, to the leadership of Solidarity and all the other unions as well. Thank you for this opportunity, GS, and obviously to our host as well. I was just thinking back to when I made a similar presentation in 2014, that the room really erupted into song. And this year, it's been very quiet. So I guess it's a sign of things to come in terms of the bargaining round that we'll have this year. So what I've done is I've put together, I was asked to just give the economic landscape that we are operating within. Can I just check, I'm getting a bit of an echo. Can you all hear me clearly? Okay, thanks. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give, in a few slides, I'm just going to run quickly through the economic overview of the metals and engineering sector. The beauty of the stats that I'll put up is that there's essentially no positioning, and that the facts that are here are true to all of us, irrespective of whether you're coming from labor or whether you're coming from the employer side. And really what I want to do, if you take away anything from this presentation, I'm going to preempt my very last line in the slide. That basically talks to the fact that we are in an environment where the demand side and the supply side factors are not shaping in the favor of the sector, and we're in trouble from both sides. And why that's particularly important is that there are instances where you have the demand side, so you've got strong demand, but poor supply, and then companies make a plan to meet that demand, however they go about it. You have instances where you have strong demand, but vice versa, where you've got no demand, but supply is strong, and then of course your supply factors are coming together, and then of course in that case it's just a price issue. The environment we find ourselves is where the demand side and the supply side factors are not shaping in our favor. So I'm just going to quickly run through, that's the presentation outline. There are some technical stats that I will put up. So what you will find at the top of each presentation, and I'll refer to it when I get there, in a number of the technical stats that I'll put up, at the top of each slide, I basically land the main message that we want to run into that through that slide. So we'll look at, as I said, a few issues, but where I want to focus on a lot is number 6, where we are identifying the major constraints that we are running into as a sector into the medium term. Also, the way we've structured this presentation is to look at the medium-term outlook, so the period in which we are going to be bargaining for, assuming that it obviously is a longer-term deal that stretches into the medium term, 3 years and out. But key is I'll highlight these areas around where the major constraints that we see as being major constraints holding back the sector and the economy as well. I think in this room, CIFSA doesn't need much of an introduction, but we're an employer federation, as you'd know, 18 independent associations. The metals and engineering sector represents 2.6% directly, and if you account for the indirect factors, you're on about 4.5%, going on 5%. So quite a substantial sector. And I mean, if you recently heard the Minerals Council yesterday releasing their stats, mining has decreased to about 6.2% of the economy. So this sector is punches very well above, if you look at it on the indirect measure, punches considerably in terms of the major economic players, and it's an important economic driver. Employment, at least according to our estimates, is in the order of 362,000 with 217,000 blue collar workers. Because this presentation is going to be circulated, these are just stats about the sector. 900 billion rand in turnover, 40% of that is exported, which comes up to about $20 billion US. So it prompts up the trade balance in that sense. Also employee earnings, as well as our contribution to GDP. That's what you have here. This will be circulated, so I don't want to waste too much time in it. What's important to do then is to just start off by defining the sector. So metals and engineering is the entire value chain, which is everything from metal production, and we then have service centers and merchants, and then downstream as well, which is heavy and light engineering. So that's the value chain that is represented. So later when I talk the sector, I'm talking these 11 subsectors that make up metals and engineering, which in turn collectively account for 26% of manufacturing, and I've mentioned other contribution to GDP. But the point that we often stress is that this is in essence the backbone of industrialization. To understand this schematic is then to understand basically everything that I'm going to then be talking through, because around this here is how we model the economic prospects for the sector. In there, what you basically have on the left-hand side, which is the blue, my apologies, okay, here's the laser. The blue here basically accounts for the domestic sector. So the broad split of production is 60% is sold and produced for the domestic market, with 40% being exported. In there, you then have the sectors that we supply to. As I mentioned, this is quite a significant sector in that we supply agri, mining, some products come back into the sector, chemicals, construction, automotive, etc. So when this sector ticks, it ticks right across the entire economy. That's the point to highlight here. Then 40% of the product is exported. What we also do here is just break up the sectors that we export. Predominantly, most of the product goes into the African continent. So as I said, to understand the schematic, I'm now just going to go building on the factors that touch on it. Now, the direction of influence in any economic model is global, country, and then sector. So that's the view I'm going to go to. When I talk global now, I'm obviously mainly addressing this area here. So we find ourselves, and now I said this, we've structured looking into the into at least the 3 years to the medium term. So anything between 3 to 5 years are the stats that we're putting in. So right now we find ourselves in a situation where the global economic environment is expected to flatline at least into the medium term. These are IMF figures that you have here, where you have no major significant moves in the estimates for growth. So global growth, 3.1, 3.1, 3.2. Later I'll be expanding on the timeline as well. A major concern that has been an overhang for the global economy has been inflation post the COVID pandemic. That has been largely contained due to higher interest rates. But now we have a situation where you have interest rates inflation rates rather starting to decline, but also then that's what's affecting growth. So in essence, the relationship is as interest rates increase, you have constraints on people's spending power, companies' spending power, investment decisions, because the cost of capital is much more. So as you have then your interest rates increasing, you cool global demand. By cooling global demand, you also cool inflation. So if you like, that project from a central bank point of view has been successful in cooling inflation. These are the numbers in terms of the outlook. So we see it coming down. We also see it mainly coming down in the developed markets, which is both a plus and a minus, because the developed markets have been the latest jobs numbers from the US were about 300,000 jobs, which was double the market expectation. So the idea is that you have strong economic activity globally in the advanced economies, but then of course much of that is undone by the domestic environment. So that's where we find ourselves. Importantly also, which is important for us as a sector, is that fiscal policy across many regions in the world has also been divergent, I think is a word to use. Divergent in the sense that how companies have responded to the recovery to the COVID pandemic is in essence what's shaping how policymakers are then deploying their fiscal policies, which again can be a double-edged sword for us as well, because that's in essence what creates global demand. What I then do, as I mentioned, it's global, and then I was brief on global because that there's too many factors to take in there, but I think that's the headline important points to consider. What I then do here in setting up where I'm going with the presentation also is then to look at the domestic economy and the expectations in the near term. You'll see, I think, just to preempt the slide, that domestic constraints, as I mentioned, the main message is captured there, that domestic constraints are limiting the medium-term outlook, and I'll unpack those domestic constraints. But what you have here is that in the at least medium term, 3 to 5 years, the economy is only expected to grow at about 1.5%. That's an average number for that period. Why this number should be important to us is, if you are to look at here, the period 2000 to 2008, the economy at the time was growing in excess of 4%. So 4.2% is the number. And that's the equivalent time when this sector was growing also in that region of about 4.5% on a GDP measure. So economic growth for the sector is important. That's the point to take from here. And there's historic precedence for it. So during the period 2008 to 2023, which has really been the worst of times, if you like, post-democracy, the worst economic time has been experienced in this period, 2008, 2023. And the sector, the economy rather, has grown about 1.2%. And I'll show in my next slide how that's translated to this sector's performance. The point really is that when the economy was growing at that pace, the sector was growing at that pace. What you need for steel product consumption is the economy to grow at about 2.5% plus for you to see meaningful consumption of steel sector products. This part we saw a decline because, as I've mentioned, it's below that 2.5 mark. So what should concern us obviously is that those domestic constraints affect the medium-term outlook, which then of course should be a concern for us. So that's the first important point to highlight from this in terms of the medium-term outlook. What I then do here is I've already preempted in the last slide that during this period here when the economy, 2000 and 2008, when the economy was also growing at 4.2%, this sector, so what you have here is production for metals and engineering, the sector that we all represent in this room. The sector on a GDP measure was growing at 4.6%, production was growing at about 3%. I mean, you need that over 2 decades to double production, just to give you the sense of how significant that growth rate is. But you then have 2008, which was a game changer for the South African economy as well as the global economy, well, mainly the South African economy and this sector as well, because when the 2008 global financial crisis happened, the sector has not recovered to pre-global financial crisis levels. That's the first important point here. So that's why you see this major break. And during that time, we've been averaging 15% below the 2008 peak, and also production during this period, when I also mentioned the economy was also slowing, production has been decreasing at about 1.3%. That's on a compound basis. So consider that as year-on-year declines for the entire sector in terms of the contraction during that period. What I also just highlight, which I think is important for the discussion that we have here today, is these periods that I've highlighted here are the instances of the last rounds of negotiation that also resulted in industrial action. And what we do see with these stats is, apart from the fact that the sectors has not recovered from the global financial crisis and the economy has been a major overhang on the sector, these periods of industrial action also contribute to the downward spiral that we see production resulting. And there's some stats that I didn't include them here, but the stats to back up that major disruptions to the downside also affect the sector long-term, as well as the employment prospects of the sector. And then, of course, 2024 is anyone's guess, but I guess that's what we are all tasked with solving in this room. Then I unpack the constraints. So I'm going to go through these quite fairly quickly because I think they're known to most of us. But what I do here is attach some numbers to that, to those constraints. So I've mentioned that the economy is not growing and is expected not to grow into the medium term because of the constraints that we know. I listed them under bullet 6 at the beginning. And the first obvious one that we are facing now is energy constraints. That has been a case since 2008. And what you have on this slide here is, what we are highlighting is that energy production, especially grid-grade energy production, given the energy consumption profile of the sector, which is generally high, medium to high consumption, the performance of the grid, if you consider Eskom generated electricity, has a direct bearing on this sector's performance. So that's why you see quite a strong correlation in this slide here. And again, if you put numbers to it, pre-2008, pre the electricity crisis, when electricity generation was also growing at about 1.1%, that's the electricity generation from Eskom. That's that equivalent period where the sector was also growing, as I've highlighted earlier on. Since 2008, we've seen a downward spiral. So you've got the economy not performing, you've got energy production starting to deteriorate, all being factors that influence the outcomes that we see here. And then, of course, at the end here, we see quite a divergence because of my next slide, which I'll get to now. You see a divergence now between electricity production as well as production in the sector. Or rather, let me make the point correctly. You see a divergence between private sector generated electricity as well as Eskom generated electricity. So the blue line shows that trend that I was mentioning earlier on. From 2008 to present day, we've got that deterioration in grade electricity. You then also have quite a lot of apologies. You have quite a lot of private sector generated electricity coming on stream, but this is mainly at rooftop level because we know the IPP projects as well as the Renewable Independent Power Purchase Program hasn't really taken off to the extent that it was envisaged to take off. So what you have is quite a lot of private sector generated electricity coming on, and we obviously ask the question, we do know reforms are underway. They are factoring in, but it's also a survival mode where we've seen, I think, people in their personal and professional lives, we see them making alternative energy plans. So you see that as a dynamic starting to come into play. Also, this here, maybe I'm touching on the reforms here. When you look at how much projects NERSA is registering in terms of private generation of electricity. So we see a rebalancing of the economy in that area. We also have another major constraint, which is Transnet. And what you have here is Transnet's real trouble starting also in about 2015. They've generally been underlying issues, but the real trouble started in about 2015. And again, just listening to some of the conversations coming out of the mining indaba, this area in terms of logistics for mining, for our sector as well, in terms of getting product to port, getting product in, because we are quite a trade intensive industry, product going both directions has been influenced by the deterioration in Transnet. Also, what you see very strongly happening is the amount of cargo being put on road. So you see that as being increasing. I guess here we intend the pun, but of course, by the point really is that you've seen a lot of traffic move onto road, then a more costly exercise. So what you then have is that fueling a lot of unsustainable input cost increases, as well as eroding companies' competitiveness. So that's constraint number 2. Constraint number 3 is something we've been keeping quite an eye on and increasingly is worrying us, and that's the deterioration of local government service delivery at local government level. So these are some stats that we put up that show the fact that 70% of municipalities right now are in financial distress, and you see that number only increasing. And why this should be concern us in the immediate as well as into the long term is that firstly, it's difficult to change. We understand that. That's one. But 2, local service delivery is the last mile of delivery. So if you take it from an energy generation point of view, you can generate, you can fix your generation assets, you can expand the transmission grid. But if that last mile is not working effectively, all your efforts upstream are undone. And that applies to water, it applies to electricity, as I've mentioned, and all other forms of service delivery. So this is increasingly something that has been keeping us awake at night. And we hear from companies who report daily at a micro level the implications of the local service delivery implications. So the numbers here, 70% of municipalities are financially in distress. Also, you have households being the largest debtor to municipalities. Now, when I put these stats together, the first thought that came to mind, obviously, is the fact that this here is in an election year, and even post that, I mean, this is in essence the voter base. So how you fix this here and go after defaulting municipalities, you can imagine the politics that come into there. So that should worry us. So it's not so much the quantum at 182 billion, but it's how much more it is than all the others. Also, another concerning issue is the fact that municipal creditors, the majority of municipal creditors are Eskom and services as well. So again, you have services being supplied, but the money not being transmitted back to Eskom. So we highlight this as constraint number 3. This, in just adding to that issue about municipal services deteriorating, right? Again, what you have here is a growing instance of municipalities who have, or rather, let me put it this way. Looking at the latest stats, 63% of municipalities have funded budgets. The balance don't. So again, that gives you a sense of the predicament that local governments face even into the near term. And the question there is Treasury, who are also financially constrained, where will they get that money to solve these issues? Even if you don't get into the fact that are these inefficiencies or the rest. So that's constraint number 3, local government. The fourth one, which really, again, should concern us, and this is the split of investment into the economy. So I mentioned earlier on, or I might not have mentioned it, what drives this sector's demand is capital spend into the economy, and that's irrespective of where it comes from, private sector or the state. Now, the NDP sets a target of 30% of GDP should be what we invest annually into the economy from a capital spend. The likes of China, as well as Singapore and a few other countries who have had significant growth rates, these are the numbers that they push against. So that's the NDP target, and that's the target that we set for ourselves locally. But you then see where we are. The latest number is at about 12, 13%. So again, what contributes not only to the economy not growing, which transmits to the sector not growing, but also this lack of capital spend also then is also constraining the demand for the sector. An important point I just want to stress here is you'll see the split again. The blue line is private sector investment relative to GDP. The red line is public sector investment. Now, again, if we're then, so apart from the fact that it's low, Again, one issue that comes from here is that with public sector spend, you then can set policy that drives industrialization, because you can almost have, you've got the power to create policies over that spend, like localization, like the public procurement bill, something that's kept us also very busy. Here, while it's welcome that private sector investment, be it by the mines, be it by any private business, etc., you don't have, there's no immediate lever to control where that's spent. So all of this, for argument's sake, is registered as investment but could be imported. So you can't necessarily drive an industrialization project on the basis of this investment, but it's still welcome. And what will drive this private sector investment is confidence in the economy, which is something that's been lacking. I think I'll be laboring the point if I just talk through this one, but here what I overlay is those investment trends on GDP. You see a high correlation. So greater investment drives economic growth. I think that's the point. I just want to leave it at there. Linking my point to the last point I made in the last slide is that public sector investment and the capacity of the state to spend, which is what you can drive industrialization on, we find ourselves that it is limited right now in the environment that we go into, because if you look at the way the state has borrowed between 2008, so the red line here measures your loans, your total loans that you're borrowing relative to GDP. The number started at about 25% in 2008. And during this period when the economy has deteriorated, we're now sitting at about 70% of debt to GDP. That's the ratio that we sit at. Also in there, you see here, this is the forecast from National Treasury, which shows you that in the period that now we are going into, so 2023 to about 2027, that debt to GDP ratio is expected only to increase before it starts to taper off into the outer years of 28 and outside. So again, that just explains the period that we're going into now and the difficulties. What you have here as the bars that are coming down here is the debt service costs as a percentage of GDP. It's currently sitting, so you measure this on this side here, and it's currently sitting at about 4.5%, and that could spike to about 5%. So it's your fastest growing element on your spending side. And the risk really is that this is going to eat up possible money that could be deployed in the economy because, I make the point. I'll be laboring it if I make it any further. But then, in essence, this debt service cost, which is in the order of about 350 billion rand a year, is money that could be otherwise spent in the economy. But in this instance that we find ourselves, the state is constrained then to make to spend on an industrialization project. So again, it just paints the picture into the medium term in terms of what we are facing. I then put up some labor statistics just around where I guess some are for interest, and I just want to highlight 1 or 2 points. So for the sector, total labor costs make up 20% of total input costs, if you include the import bill as well. But when you look at it in terms of GDP, compensation to employment makes up 80%. So when you talk the value that's generated by the sector, 80% of that is compensation to employees, then the rest is made up of return to capital as well as depreciation, which is a proxy for investment. So that's the structure of the sector: 20% input costs and then 80% of the GDP created by the sector. But what we have seen is, and this is a trend again that should concern all of us, everything I've mentioned in the last few slides have led to a deterioration in the sector's production as well as a deterioration in employment figures. So this is our latest estimate as of 2023, the sector employing 362,000. But I think what should worry us, of course, there is the trend from a peak of 2008, which I've been comparing to since, to now 362,000. That's a loss of about 214,000 jobs, a 40% decline and a 3% compound rate of decline. Also, I guess maybe these stats are more for interest, so I won't dwell too much on them, but the split is 90% downstream to 10% upstream. That's how the employment is split. What we have seen, and why this slide I thought was important to contribute today, is following the recent discussions and the announcements by ArcelorMittal, we were involved in, as well as a few faces in the room as well, were involved in this downstream crisis summit around discussions of what can be done to resolve the issues there around AMSA. And we were tasked then to try and calculate some potential employment implications from that development. We then took a step back, and I'll get into that in my next slide. But the point here that we were building in that presentation, and I think what is the important point, is that many of the job losses have been in the downstream, and that's in essence what you get here. So of that 214,000 jobs that I mentioned earlier on, 60% of those job losses were in the downstream, and you're talking in the order of about 120, 130,000 jobs. So that's where the pressure is, although the implications have been across the entire value chain. This point, I always make the point that we've made ad nauseum, and my colleagues in the office have probably heard me over and over, but I think it's an important point to stress, particularly now as we're faced with going into this round of negotiations and the discussions that we'll have. And really, it's to highlight the fact that historically, you had a strong relationship between production and employment. So increases in production resulted in increases in employment. You have a strong correlation. That was the historic relationship. What you now have is what we are terming a decoupling in that relationship. And it's not, you could say, unique to this sector, but it's a phenomenon we must keep in mind. And that's in essence that the relationship between employment and production is deteriorating. So put differently is that increases in production are not necessarily directly yielding to increases in employment because of mechanization, because of things like importing, etc. So the point really is that this is an economic phenomenon that we must keep in mind at any given time, that especially now because the relationship is only deteriorating. This decoupling is something well and truly underway. And I guess the point really is that in how we go forward, we have to keep that context in mind as well. I mentioned here some of the, you will get this presentation, but what we had done is I mentioned that we try to quantify the likely outcome from the AMSA discussion, and the point that we really tabled there, and I guess my one headline point here would be that a company and the developments like AMSA is the biggest steel producer in the country, yes, so it grabs the headlines. But the point we've been saying is that these pressures of employment losses have been felt across the sector. And that's how we then tabled the proposal at this conference that I mentioned, that you can't only look at the possible implications from the long steel division closing, you actually have to look at the fact that the pressure has actually been across the entire value chain. And that's what we in essence see here. So we quantify some of the numbers, applying some multipliers, and this is over a 5-year view. But the point really is that at least on a 5-year view, if nothing changes, and you say history is a predictor of the future, and we've been losing employment at a rate of 2.9% on a compound basis, and you project that into the long term, saying if we don't resolve energy, we don't resolve the logistics, we don't resolve the municipal pressures that are coming, and all the things I've mentioned, you can reasonably assume that rate of decline continues. And then if you project that out into the 5-year horizon, you've got an excess of 50,000 jobs, at least that would be at risk, because you're only continuing the trend. But the point also is that if you then apply the steel sector economic multiplier for employment, you have that number in the order of about 290, 300,000 economy-wide jobs that would be left. I'm actually almost done, so I'm on my conclusion slide. So the main message, and I said earlier on that I'm preempting my very last slide, my very last line in the presentation, is that we are battered and bruised from all directions. The supply side is constrained, as I mentioned, so the supply factors are not coming. In fact, they're only deteriorating, and that affects production. The demand side is equally constrained in the sense that global growth is flatlining. Domestic growth, because of a lack of investment in the economy, is only expected to, again, flatline and more to the downside. So there's a lot of downside risks, as well as the fact that yes, we acknowledge that there is reforms underway. We as the CIFSA office are involved in many initiatives around unlocking the reforms, but reforms take time to take shape. And reasonably, one can make the point that even with all the reform efforts underway in the country, you can expect that in the medium to long term, the period that we are having this discussion for, you can expect things to remain the same, at least in the medium term outlook, until those reforms take shape. And again, as the point really has been made, that the environment is not conducive and has really been one for difficult times. So that's my bit, and I hope I could just add to the conversation that we'll have over the next few days. Thank you, Program Director. No.
Thank you so much, Tafi. And for obvious reasons, there will be no comments at all to the presentation that has been made. We will allow an opportunity for at most 3 questions. Nuran, bearing in mind that we've got our online participants, maybe let's take 2 from the floor here and allow an opportunity for at least 1 from our colleagues online. And of course, it will bounce back to the room if there is no hand online. I've got a hand from the NUM. And shall we all agree that all the questions will come up and then Tafi will respond to all 3 of them at the same time? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Program Director. My name is Mawanga Madolo. I'm the metal sector coordinator for the NUM. Mine is a precise question. I think the presenter mentioned something quite interesting about the decoupling, whereby the production and employment seems to be going far apart. One would want to get an indication, the beneficiary of that, because it would mean, from where I'm sitting, if you were employing an example of about 1,000 workers, and your production remains at that level of your production remains consistent throughout, and your employees have declined over a period of time to relatively about half of that. And the end result, in my view, but that the employer has benefited out of that. I would want the speaker to maybe confirm that view that I am interpreting as a layman. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have a hand from CEO, and I've noted you, Wasa. Nuran, do you have a hand online? Thank you. I will give an opportunity to you, Janri. Oh, thank you. Shall we then give an opportunity to Wasa Sipo? Right at the back there.
Mine will be, thank you, Program Director. Mine will be very short, but I want the speaker to talk to the issue of monetary policy vis-a-vis speaking to exports and how those exports can be assisted by the monetary policy. So I just wanted him to talk to that.
Thank you so much. There's no other hand. Thank you, colleagues. Tafi, over to you.
All right, thanks for the question. I didn't get the second gentleman's name, but Maunga, your question around the decoupling and who benefits. I think the way to look at it, and I see how in coming to that interpretation, maybe one thing I should have unpacked on that slide is that, but I think I did refer to it. Employment has declined and so has production. But the decoupling happens where employment has declined at a much faster rate than production. So it's not to say that it's been declining. It's not to say that that relationship is weakening, but it's the rate of decline that has been more on the one end. If the scenario that was being painted was that production has been increasing and consistently, and we've got a vertical graph 90 degrees while employment is decreasing, that's where I think a question like that can be raised, where you say there's clear benefit here where it's not being transferred fairly in terms of sharing of the cake. But that's not the case in terms of this scenario that I've painted. But I think more than that interpretation, what's more important is that as the world evolves, right? So it's not unique to this sector that we are in right now. As the world evolves, you see economies making that shift, or traditionally industrial sectors making that type of shift, where you see the role of labor in value creation declining because of trade, global trade, because of mechanization. So in a way, one can say it's almost an unstoppable trend, right, globally, because it's an economic phenomenon. But the question is, how do we slow it down and not make it worse so that it's the preferred option for an employer who then says, I might as well fast track that underlying trend. I hope that addresses it. The one on monetary policy versus exports, I think the best way to approach this is that monetary policy, one, around inflation, that's what it looks to control. And with monetary policy, the next variable that is then controlled might be the word, but influenced, maybe the better word, is the exchange rate. So your export competitiveness then has a function there, right? But I think to look at monetary policy and exports are too far apart, because monetary policy is not after, even in textbook or even the Reserve Bank here or even the world over. The monetary policy, the central banks in some areas where they have an expanded mandate might include economic growth, they might include employment creation as add-ons to inflation management that they consider when they're managing their economy. But never is exports included in there. So I think the relationship between monetary policy and the exports is indirect, in the sense that as your exchange rate moves up and down, it either creates an incentive or a disincentive to exports. And right now we know that the weaker rand from a manufacturing and export competitiveness has actually been on the plus for the country. But of course that has its own negatives that come into it. So yeah, I'll park it there, and just maybe the headline point there is that it's not the target variable. And I think it would be too much to try and load exports as well as a condition for how you manage monetary policy. But it's an indirect consequence of monetary policy management. Thank you.
A big round of applause for Trevor.
Your notes. Thank you so much, Tafi. We are now running 10 minutes behind schedule, as we ask for the General Secretary of NUMSA, the Metal Workers Union of South Africa, to come forward and address the meeting. As he walks up, just to mention that he also has 30 minutes, and also warn him. So I've been ruled out. Thank you so much.
Amandla. Amandla. Eva nomsa viva. Molweni makabani. I have a duty and a task to make a contribution on behalf of the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa. And I was listening to the economic debate. I was really tempted to engage because I guess there have been funny set of arrangements that have taken place this week. At the beginning of the week, I had to attend something called NEDLEC school. And I've never seen such a big venue and long called in Kiviskroon, where all federations of trade unions in South Africa met. They were discussing in a school. I don't know how to explain that. It's when you are old enough like me, you decide to be a child, you go back and be in a school. So Netlek, Kosatu, Saftu, Fedusa. And one of the things that for me stand out was the fact that the relevance of Netlek, the relevance of CCMA, which addressed us there, was always at the center of the growth of the economy. In class terms, we used to define those institutions when Elias Monache was still my sector coordinator as corporatist institutions, institutions whose mission and task is to promote class harmony in a class divided society. I'm in two minds about that because in a very big way, when we had 1994 political breakthrough, the working class was organized, was united in this country. And those institutions, they played a very critical role to demobilize the working class. And what was striking me was that in Cape Town, there is mining in Indaba, which I must fly to. You can't get a flight to Cape Town, it's mining in Indaba. You can't get a place to sleep. All hotels are not charging less than 7,000 a night. But there's mining in Indaba in Cape Town. There's a school, I'm just talking about this week. When I was sitting in that school, I was crying for debate about how do we drive manufacturing and industrialization? How do we grow the economy? How can there be a mining in Indaba when unions are sitting in a school choosing to be children in Pretoria? We're meeting here today in a very strategic session to discuss collective bargaining, which is more relevant if at the same time the economy grows. That's why I was saying when I was listening that even the local state, the municipalities have collapsed. And we know why they collapsed. In 1996, when Sweetleaf and Vuyom Lokoti were tasked to club together those pockets of poor municipalities, when the National Treasury at the same time was reducing allocation to those municipalities. Surely, you do not expect a municipality that does not generate revenue a municipality who cannot even produce a local economic plan to be economically viable. When metros were introduced, it means cross-subsidization to those municipalities was stopped. So I'm just saying that input stimulated me as I was sitting down, but I had to behave. And there was a song we used to sing to SIFSA, and the song goes like, "Wesifsa sugendlile awusiboni siyazaba awusiboni awusiboni siyasa niyesa sugendlile awusiboni awusiboni siya awusiboni siyasabalaza hulmente suke awusiboni siyasa hulmente suke awusiboni siya. That's a song I think we need to go back to. And I'm gonna try and summarize my input and shut up. I think that NUMSA takes this opportunity to remind the social partners in this process of engagement that collective bargaining can be compared to trade unions that are voluntary organizations. As a collective bargaining is about parties understanding that negotiations is about give and take. Trade unions are joined voluntary. It is not trade unions that are joining workers, it is workers who voluntarily join trade unions. But I'm also comparing that to negotiations, and I'm saying negotiations is about give and take. And it doesn't mean you must not exist. And when I say give and take, this really means that parties in the negotiations being prepared to move from their positions. In all that is important to anchor our negotiations in the state of play of both the economy and socio-economic conditions of workers and the working class in general. It is NUMSA's honest view and submission that in our country across various sectors of the economy, where labor and business is bargaining, in many cases, it is never about the difficulties of finding one another and making necessary compromises. And I'm not saying if you reflect to negotiations which this pre-bargaining as conveners to think and to talk to ourselves, to talk to partners. And I'm not saying if you look to the history of disputes, deadlocks, strikes that we happen to have to manage and to look for solutions, it has never been that there are no solutions. But negotiations will be polarized and end up in disputes, sometimes in long, unnecessary protracted strikes that have the capacity to ruin the economy simply because one party or another has not completely moved away from our dreadful past. I think we had the past that polarized industrial relations in this country. We had the past where workers were not known by their name as they were running production. They were just supposed to work. Nobody cares under which condition they live and so forth. That past continues to be part of our life. In some companies, the old is dying, but the new is refusing to be born. where we used to have polarized industrial relations between labor and business, where you find a group of employers who are still victims of adversarialism, where they still believe, as an attitude of mind and a way of life, that it to be anti-worker, union-bashing attitude is correct, and as such, it shapes your attitude in how you engage. I don't know how to simplify that. Anti-worker. You like this worker because you employ, but he mustn't talk, he mustn't think. It's worse if he decides to exercise his freedom of association and join a union voluntary, as I said. And then you show him your true colors. And I'm saying sometimes in the deadlocks we have, we're dealing with these stereotypes. Stereotype of anti-worker, union-bashing attitude. And then it permeates that even if we're in negotiations, you can see the forest, but you can't see the trees. I don't know how to handle that. Somebody is in the middle of the forest, but he has no sense that this forest is a product of the trees. You can't have such a combination in your head. There's a problem. This time we want to call everybody to allow such a thinking to wither away, as it has no place in the industry. I wish I could say this in a very nice way, that this kind of attitude I'm talking about, surely if you understand, you have a sense of the deeper challenges that confront us in this country, surely that attitude, we should agree that it must wither away. We don't need it in the industry. Worst of all, if one has an understanding of serious peculiar challenges that are confronting the economy and our sector, where in the main, we need a common perspective from both business and labor if we are to defend the current existing capacity for manufacturing. And I think we should say that from NUMSA, Solidarity, and all other unions that are in this industry, we have got a duty together with employers to be a voice of reason that win the day and the moment in the country, to say manufacturing matters. We can't have interest rates that are militating against manufacturing and industrialization. We should be very clear that this country is rich with all kinds of minerals. Those minerals must be beneficiated here. We must build new sectors, create more jobs that are paying a living wage. And that's the future of this country. That's the future of this country. And NUMSA will be convening and inviting employers and everybody else into a summit in April, where we're going to put this thing up there in the public, where we're going to invite ministers to tell them that you can't be hoping that the economy is going to grow when you plunge the country into rolling blackouts that are sabotaging the economy. Small, medium-sized companies cannot be able to survive. I don't know, in Sikhosa, it's on and off, and we're not coming up as an industry to say this must stop. We know how it can stop. It's about quality maintenance of power stations. It's about reconnecting those units that were disconnected at the back of $8.5 billion. That, I mean, America, Europe, and so forth, their energy is on the base load of coal, is on a base load of nuclear, is on a base load of gas. But we're told not to touch coal. Van der Bay, who built Eskom, who was an Afrikaner, who built ISCO, which we know as ArcelorMittal, he was not smoking Dacha when he built those two institutions. He was serious about delivering to the economy a competitive electricity tariff, which is reliable. We needed AMSA or ISCO today to ensure that it gives us steel for both upstream and downstream industries to create the necessary jobs. We needed railways to move those commodities. All CEOs of, whether you go to TPA in PE, the CEO is suspended. The CEO of Transnet had to leave. And she left, not because she liked to. The Transnet is being auctioned. She must sell the profitable lines and railway lines. There's no investment on the capacity because the country is held hostage by austerity measures. And I'm saying the industry need to come up very clear around that. I know that when Elias comes up, whether it is Busa or there's some confusion. Yo, it's the Black Business Council, but any trade union. But I'm saying to the industry, we need to do that more. Otherwise, we got the window of manufacturing being withering away, being destroyed, and already the levels of deindustrialization that have taken place in this country should make us not to be speaking English, nice, soft English. We must be clear about what must be done. So I'm going to run fast because I saw a man with a white paper here. He's very good. I don't want him to lift that paper for me. So there are two things we closed the year having to respond to. It was the ban on scrap metal that government wanted to extend. We said, you must listen to the industry. There's no policy that must be cast in stone. Somehow there's consensus emerging, but it looks like government says to business, no, look, you must basically take responsibility for scanners now in the ports, and we will give you this port and that port to export scrap. And business says, but already these ports are jam-packed. You know, they say we must not touch coal, but our coal is leaving the country in droves, our best coal. And we're sitting in rolling blackouts. Mihlo. So we need to arrest that. AMSA, we think we have pushed government to make some concessions such that AMSA can delay what they want to do. But of course, workers are not being spared. They now don't want to give increases. And NUMSA is very smart. We had some good percentage for last year, for this year and next year. We just said, fine, give us CPI. They believe they're paying our members very well. They don't want to pay now, they want to have a wage freeze. But if AMSA were to pull a trigger, I was showing there somebody who's moving my slides. Yeah, okay. If you look at the hemorrhaging of what would happen in the industry, 70,000 steel that capacity will be lost to the value of 10 billion of local production and so forth. I'm arguing that crisis is not just a crisis of AMSA. It is a crisis that as the industry we must come together and find solutions such that that trigger is not being pulled. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I mean, 17 companies will close in the component value chain. We would have to basically dump localization, which is the key to us. And I already indicated of the work that we have done in making sure that we are pushing. And it's important to say, NUMSA's attitude is that we must address everything. We must address the state of the economy, defend the current capacity, grow jobs, but at the same time, appreciate that workers, the agreement we signed in 2021 has come to an end. I don't know how to explain that. Because, guys, we didn't need that strike in 2021. If you want to ask me why, we didn't need the strike because why did we then finally settle in the middle of a strike? Why did we compromise then? Which means we can find in the storehouse of men and women in this industry who are negotiating, we can come up with an agreement that can cater for workers and the working class in this industry. One person who's got a job in South Africa, beyond Stats and Stats SA and other statistic companies, they support 5 to 6 extended families. Why would we not do everything in negotiations and ensure that we move from our position and find a compromise and settle this round of negotiations properly? And I'm just saying, NUMSA is the most militant union. No, there are many unions, but NUMSA is the most militant union. Workers are ready to fight, but NUMSA members want us to settle this round of negotiations. They carry the burden of 5, 6 extended families. Their life has become so hard and to working class families today. I mean, if you look on the household affordability in 2022, if you talk about transport to work, back will cost a worker an average of 1,408, and electricity 731 rands, and a basket of 44 basic foodstuff, 4,450. This has become worse today. All of this, the lives of workers in terms of socio-economic conditions of the working class. If you're talking about food access inadequate, people who get food, you know, but there are people who are in severe conditions. The situation was worse then. It has deepened now with levels of unemployment. People are losing jobs. There's no hope for the future. Poverty is very rife. And we cannot transform our economy without transforming the wage dispensation to one that provides decent work and decent wages. Wage negotiations are a platform to look to these socio-economic conditions of the working class. In 2022, all workers across all grades received increases lower than the annual average inflation of 6.9%. Workers saw an actual decrease in their salaries between 1.9% and 1.4% in 2023. Workers in the majority of grades receive increases lower than the average annual inflation of 6%. For 2 straight years, workers in the industry have been facing losses on their actual wages. This pre-bargaining conference takes place against such a backdrop. This is consistent with a particular trajectory where for the past couple of years now, the workers' share in the national income have been going down. So I know Lucio will immediately check that I'm saying, Lucio, the majority of workers in the industry, they basically receive less than what the inflation was from 2022. Maybe you can say grade A, is it grade A? Grade A, little bit. But the bottom line, if you're talking about the majority of workers in the industry, they have got a huge challenge. So, with these structural challenges, parties must be prepared to negotiate for settlement, which will settle this round of negotiation. And to settle any negotiation, it takes parties being prepared to move from their position. That's the first point we think we should. We're going back to really collect mandates from our members. We have got an agreement which was a product of a compromise. NUMSA has been debating, do we open negotiations and go plant by plant to collect demands? Do we consider to improve the current agreement with a particular sweetener that suits the conditions of workers and the state of the economy? We're asking ourselves those questions. We're calling on the industry to also ask those difficult questions. Because I think as a union, we know one thing, that united we stand, divided we fall. We don't need to be lectured on that. Unity is a strength. And we're saying, if we're to go back and take stock of the fact that we've got that agreement, and maybe we can be creative enough. You know, I'm not talking now till I've got a mandate properly. And think of a sweetener that improves this agreement and push it forward. But there are a couple of other things that we might say to the industry you must look at. Like, I don't know, in every family, there's always a person who creates problems. No, that thing is not just happening at NUMSA. NUMSA has got many of those members of the family that are a problem. Of course, we face them at NUMSA. But SEPSA, you need to face some of the people who create problems. The agreement is there in black and white. They find their way. And as and when workers are not happy about what they are doing, they create a problem for all of us. So I'm just saying we will package those issues vis-a-vis the creativity of the kind of mind and see whether we cannot be able to ensure that we move fast and find a quick settlement in this round of negotiations. That's our attitude. The other thing we think the industry must use this round of negotiations to deal with is the fact that a worker in the engineering sector work here for years, and when he goes on retirement, my Lord, my God, he takes his last little money to build a house, to try and build a house for himself. He wants a roof. And then he built. When the house is almost here, closer to the roof, mali pelile, stress kicks in, he sleeps, he dies, he doesn't wake up. We're saying in this round of the negotiations, one of the things we must think about, we're sitting over 100 billion in the retirement funds that are there in the industry. Really? Can't we ring fence 2 to 10 billion? I'm saying 2, so that if you say 10, maybe you can say 2, but I'm saying, can't we ring fence 2 to 10 billion and go to government and say these workers are workers who are not quickly endorsed and supported by the banks. They're in the gap market, and they are not, government is not giving them any RDP houses. And as part of settling this round of negotiations, make sure that we also address the question of housing. Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you, General Secretary of NUMSA. As we did with the last speaker, we'll take a round of 3 questions. One from the virtual platform, around, and 2 in the room. Going, there's one hand, a lady at the back. Any other hand up front? There's no other hand in the room. Anything on the virtual platform? So there's only one hand for Mr. Jim. Thank you so much. Over to you, lady.
Thank you. I just wanted to, I'm Mamel Law from Impulse Radio and Television Africa, a Pan-African platform for all corporates within our space. I just wanted to ask something that's very sensitive. In terms of productivity and employees within our field, I think it's very important for us to highlight the percentage of people that are casuals and permanents, because in most cases, we find stats that say that there's job creation, but we don't know who are the casuals, people that are just getting wages. And that is very sensitive because we don't know what's the true reflection of our economy. So people try to cut corners and exploitations of our people, but we have to be very sensitive around that conversation because it's not a true reflection of the stats. So I would like us to have that conversation and ask questions around the stats of the permanents and the casuals when we speak about the different sectors. Thank you.
That's why we need.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Mr. Jim.
I don't interpret that as a question to me. I think she is calling for debate, discussion, and a critical reflection on workers who are permanent versus workers who are casuals. But I think one of the challenge we have, government had introduced something called youth wage subsidy. I don't know. For the rest of my life, I've been an activist. I was toy-toying when I was at school. I toy-toy when I was in the factory. I'm still toy-toying today. I think on this question of casualization of labor, if you go to Europe, there's a nice word they use to define this thing. What is the word? But what is it? There's a precarious, they give it different nice words. You think something is nice. But in reality, it's a worker who does not have benefits, who is exploited. NUMSA led in, for instance, in dealing with labor brokers, and that we secured a Apex Court ruling that if you are 3 months, you are deemed to be permanent. But this question of casualization and youth, young people who tolerate stipends, I've got a problem with a youth that doesn't want to fight. Sometimes I want to go back to youth. Because in the olden days, we used to have a ratio. An artisan in a factory will be followed by 3 to 4 semi-skilled workers. They were paid a fair kind of a wages. They are given skills. When they are permanent, when they are skilled enough, then they get to be paid permanently. So I agree fully, my sister, that that issue must be engaged. Thank you.
We are running behind schedule by more than 30 minutes. Initially, I suggested a break for about 5 minutes, and now I'm afraid we may lose the momentum. So I shall then accordingly call upon Mr. Elias Monage, the CIFSA Federation President, to come and address the meeting. Thank you so much. Give him a big round of applause. I show that yeah.
Thanks, Program Director. Colleagues, I want to
to begin with a quote, and I will then deal with the relevance why the quote is relevant in the current economic conditions, because it talks about various issues. It says, until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will glorify the hunter. I'll repeat again. It says, until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will glorify the hunter. This quote is by Chini Achebe. The relevance of this quote, colleagues, it talks about humans are never balanced in their narration. They tell stories from their own perspectives and their own truth. Whereas effective communication tells a story from all sides and recognizes the need to listen to all sides before conforming a narrative. I'm raising this quote because this pre-bargaining conference today, its purpose and its objective is for us then to read from the same script in terms of the current economic challenges facing this sector. Collective bargaining does not take place in abstract. It takes place within a set of circumstances that economically we need then to say, do we have the same understanding? Do we have the same conceptualization in terms of the challenges that faces this industry? Because if we don't, it then means our starting point, it then becomes a problem. The other component, colleagues, that I want to deal with as part of the context, again, is around what I will call it, again, a legal definition that talks about fiat constantia ruat calurium. Is a Latin phrase, which means let justice be done through the heavens fall. The maximum signifies the belief that justice must be realized regardless of the consequence. I'm saying that is the rationale and the context in which I'm raising these issues, because when we're listening to the point that is raised by both Ivan and Tafi, it's around the economic set of circumstances that we find ourselves in as a sector. From the economic crisis, low steel demand, the issues around what we call the liquid steel versus the blast furnace, which is the isometal, the flat products, the question around energy crisis, the logistics, transnet problems that we are faced with, and equally so the question of imports and exports, and the context again around Africa Free Continental trade agreement, because we don't operate in abstract as a sector. We operate within a set of rules and circumstances around protocols and harmonization of tariffs as a sector. And those are a number of areas that we need then to look at as part and parcel of the context in which collective bargaining this year must then take place. Equally so, we need also then to take into account the bilateral agreements that exist between various countries that will have a major impact and implications to this specific sector. We might also then refer to the AGOA agreement, because it deals with a specific sector or subsector in engineering, which is the automotive, because 66% of the components they manufactured from this industry. And equally so, we need also to place a context within what is called the equity equivalent in terms of ownership within the automotive. And the reason why I'm raising this point is because part of the issues that GS have raised is around
making choices. And I mean, making choices in collective bargaining is one of the critical areas, because if you don't make those choices, we then tend to create unnecessary expectations to our respective constituencies. It is within that context, then I'm saying we need to relook at the issues that GS have raised. When you mentioned that 2021, we had numbers and there was an industrial action, which is a strike, and eventually then concluded the negotiations for a period of 3 years, 2020, 2021, 22, and 23. And that agreement will then expire this year. And again, the point that you are raising is that we need to look at concluding the negotiations either with a sweetener, and without quantifying the sweetener, I think we need also then to make a clear and precise process in terms of what exactly are those choices. And the choices between and among us is around either do we reopen the negotiations entirely, where we start from scratch, or we then look at the baseline in terms of saying we do have an agreement that will then expire on the 30th of June this year. And if we don't want then to reopen the negotiations, then means we need to then talk about a sweetener, because we have a baseline in terms of the negotiations for the next coming period. And I'm saying those are the choices that we need then to look at in terms of that component. The second part is around number of areas that colleagues have raised, from the policy issues, industrialization, and various gaps that have been identified in terms of the low demand for steel industry, the energy crisis, the logistics, the rail infrastructure, including even other components that will impact on the negotiations, particularly the Botswana-Namibia rail corridor. That will also then have a major impact and implications for our rail and ports infrastructure. And therefore, we need also then to relook at the reconstruction and the recovery plan post COVID-19, because in the absence of realization of the reconstruction and recovery plan, it then means we are then back to square one in terms of the continuation of the low demand for this industry. And I think it is within that context that I'm saying we need then to have a common baseline in terms of where do we start and what are the choices before all of us. Because in the absence of an economic prospects for the sector, on the basis of the increase in the demand, including even the patterns of trade, both globally, nationally, and regionally, because it also then have a major impact and implications to collective bargaining. And hence, colleagues, we need then to make those choices. And the choices before us, again, is around how do we forge a closer collaboration and alignment between ourselves as parties, so that we then limit creating a huge expectation in the process of formulating new demands for the next coming round of negotiations. And hence, I'm saying the choices before us is around, one, relooking at the current sets of the agreements before us, so that we then factor what GS have mentioned in terms of a sweetener. It's not to reopen the entire negotiations. That's the first part. The second options is then to relook at other components that constitute a broader policy issues and framework, and those issues in the main they're around the question of metal issues, the entire downstream, including the energy crisis, the question of the logistics, and the question of the extension of the transmission lines. Because in the absence of that, again, we're going to see the continuation of a low demand for this industry. And I think it is within that context, colleagues, when I'm saying we need then to look at the choices for us, and the implications thereof is then the following. That one, if we then look at the a sweetener, given the current conditions, that means we can then conclude the negotiations within the set timelines that we have agreed upon in one of the discussions that we had. That's the first thing. The second part is that in the absence of a broader agreement on the choices on a sweetener, it then means we then open the floodgates where we proceed as if we are starting from scratch, and therefore creating that huge expectation for collective bargaining is then widened up, and the likelihood of concluding the negotiations within the agreed 3 meetings, it then becomes impossible. And for me then to conclude, colleagues, is around looking at one, what we did, I think, during the COVID period. When we had COVID, we didn't have the negotiations. We agreed on a rollover for a particular period of 12 months. And I'm saying those are some of the choices that we need then to look at. And colleagues, I think we'll then end there, unless if there are any questions for clarification. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Monache. And we are back on track in terms of our schedule. Again, 3 questions. I've got one from NUMSA inside the house. There's another one from OASA back there. Nothing from the from the virtual platform. Over to you.
Thank you, Program Director. I got 2 questions from the President of CIFSA. The first question is about the agreement that we reached in 2021 regarding the survival and recovery of the industry. For me, what became important, take to account the broader principles that underpin that program was to try to deal with some of the challenges that was been mentioned by the CIFSA economist and also the president. But something that I don't hear from CIFSA board speakers is that how does that agreement assisted them as employers in this industry? If still today we're still talking about same challenges that we've been talking about even before that agreement that was being signed between the parties. That's the first question of clarity. That we need to get a sense whether that agreement has been assisting the industry, to what extent. The second question is about AMSA. When you listen to NUMSA General Secretary and also the President of CIFSA, do mention the issue of AMSA. How can we deal with the issue of AMSA as an industry and try to find a way that AMSA brings stop to become opportunistic, begin to target employees' benefit instead of dealing with a real problem? Because currently, where we are situated, we don't know whether AMSA is correct about issues that are raising as a challenge, or AMSA, their aim is to try to reduce the workers' condition of employment. The bigger question is, how can we work together to make sure that we must stop AMSA to become opportunistic and focus to the real issue? Thank you.
Thank you, NUMSA. Over to you, Wasa.
Thank you, Program Director. I'm very careful with words because Mr. Elias Monache, the President, says that these negotiations must not take place in abstract. But the issues that has been raising are moving us to the very same problem of abstract. So I'm saying that I'm getting confused. Maybe he must be able to clarify it to me. The second question is that he's talking about a sweetener. And I really need him to really clarify it, because my understanding of sweetener might be something different. Maybe it might be a question that, no, we had an agreement, let me just put in a little bit of a house or something like that. I don't know. Maybe he must be able to be very clear If he can address me on those issues, then I'll be able to engage on the other issues that has been raised by him. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before I call upon Mr. Munachel to come to answer the questions, I just want to address a small housekeeping challenge. The door on my left here is making a lot of noise. Then can we appeal two appeals, that when a speaker is on the podium, we limit movement in the room, and then when we do move, we use the other door on the far right. If we can please help with that, that would be very helpful. Thank you so much, Mr. Munach.
Thanks. Let me deal with the question from Henry. And the answer, it requires a thorough explanation, because when ISCO was still state-owned entity, it had 26% of the mining rights of iron ore. And the 26% that was owned by ISCO, it was then used to pass it over to the local industry in terms of the price of steel consumption. When ISCO was then commercialized, it was then acquired by Metal, Metal. And that process led to Kumba consolidating the entire mineral rights of iron ore to 100%. And that led to Metal not having any percentage whatsoever in terms of the iron ore. That 26% is then gone. The second part of that problem, it then led to what you call the import parity pricing in terms of steel, because the local industries are no longer benefiting from a differentiated price of steel for local consumption. The third part of the problem was that then over the years, Industrial Development Corporation, which is IDC, supported what is called the mini mills. The mini mills predominantly, they convert steel from scrap, and that is why it is then called liquid steel, as opposed to blast furnace, because blast furnace is the iron ore that is then converted to steel, and that is the only primary steel manufacturer that is Metal. So the two, they might on face value have what is called the flat products, but they're not the same in terms of the quality, in terms of the application to various projects and programs. Now, the reason why I'm raising that point is so that we need then to revisit what I would call it an industrial policy that over the years we've basically failed then to pursue the question of industrialization, because in the main, if we're then to have that 26% of iron ore, it will then entails an element of local consumption, local industrialization, so that you then pass it over to the local industry. The second part of the reindustrialization is when we also then look at what are the things that from a primary steel producer that will have the ability to have a direct ownership of iron ore, how then do we deal with that? Because in the absence of that, it then means we are creating unfair competition between the mini mills that they convert from scrap to flat products, and then you want them to compete with them. But in terms of the quality, they're not the same. And this is one of the things that, again, if you then follow what happened at Impala when the shaft collapsed, is one thing that we need then to follow through, because if the collapse of that shaft is as a result of a rope that was done or is manufactured from scrap, it then means the major problem in terms of the quality of this thing. Now, I'm raising that point because these are some of the issues that we need then to revisit and discuss with relevant government departments in terms of reindustrialization. And that is the point that I've been raised, the General Secretary, to say we need then to have discussions around reindustrialization. The other component is that we cannot then have IDC that continue then to fund mini mills at the expense of the primary steel. Because part of the problem, when the ban of export scrap then took place, it had a major implications into metal because of energy crisis and the logistics in terms of the transportation. And I'm saying, I'm raising that point because that is the context in which we need then to look at this thing. The closure of Newcastle and Vereeniging operation, it then means the entire Newcastle will then become a gold city. And part of the discussion that I think we had the discussions from last year, November, until I think a week ago with DTIC, IDC, and various other government departments, including even Department of Public Enterprises, around how then do we create that demand for the local industry at the back of the transmission lines, at the back of the railway lines, particularly the South Rail Corridor from Roslyn to Kucha, so that if we then have that, it then creates the demand. It then means we need then to relook at industrialization. We need then to look at arms are different from what is happening currently. And I'm saying that is the context in which we need then to look at these issues. And that's the reason why I said we need then to look at this thing deeper in terms of the issues that we have raised around industrialization, including even how IDC, they are playing around continuing funding the liquid steel operations. That's the first question. The second part that you then mentioned in terms of what are the benefits. I mean, if again we then look at before we conclude before the conclusion of the agreement, I think for the past 10 years or so, the agreement that was concluded between the parties, it was not extended. And the reason why it was not extended is because of a number of reasons, in which I think for the reasons that are known to all of us, the agreement was not extended. Now, one of the benefits post the agreement that we concluded in 2021, it was then extended and gazetted, despite all other legal challenges by various other parties. But we, as things stands now, we have an agreement that is extended and gazetted by the Minister of Labour and Employment. And I think that is one benefit in terms of the extension. And the second part is around stability in the industry that we have achieved for the past 3 years, in comparison to a period of 12 to 10 years where we didn't have any collective agreement that was extended and gazetted. And that led to the collapse of the bargaining council. And I'm saying again, that is another third component for the benefit of an agreement that is extended and gazetted, and creating that stability that we require in the industry. And I think it doesn't mean that we're not going to have any challenges going forward. It then means how do we navigate and how do we deal with the issues among us as parties in terms of whatever agreement that we conclude. The point that Sipho have raised in terms of a sweetener, when I was listening to the Secretary General of NUMSA, he spoke about a sweetener. And I then took a cue from him to say, in any collective bargaining, we need then to look at the choices. I mean, the choice for all of us is that we have an agreement that is going to expire. Is there any harm if we continue with the current agreement as it stands And then part of the sweetener that you are referring to, the Secretary General then spoke about a housing component to say, can we then look at a housing? And again, this is an open debate and discussions without any mandated position. And I'm saying it then means if we then talk about the sweetener, we might then look at the housing a project, so to speak, where the pension and provident fund, they set aside a certain amount of funding available so that workers in this industry, they can basically utilize their own savings from their own pension and provident fund, as opposed to them going to banks, because part of the problems with the current constraints with financial institutions is that you cannot then get any bonded house in the rural areas because it is deemed as a tribal land, and therefore those are the restrictions and constraints for any financial institutions. Whereas if you take your own money, you then reinvest to do whatever. I'm saying those are some of the things that we need them to think out of the box, and that is the context in which I'm saying we need them to look at those things. Because it is a valid point again that we are the second biggest industry in the country. We're the second biggest pension and provident fund in the country, but we don't provide any housing in any form or shape to the employees of this fund. Now, it then means we need then to reflect in terms of the current situation to say how best can we assist the employees in this industry to have a better housing utilizing their own funds. And I'm saying that is something that can be considered in terms of having a tighter program that can address those issues. And I think I've covered the questions raised by both Henry and Sipho. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Without further ado, shall we then call to the podium the General Secretary of Solidarity, Mr. Gideon Du Plessis, to come and address the conference. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you for that revolutionary song. I was hoping for solidarity forever next time. But at least we can see there's solidarity between us, and hopefully it's a sign also for the employers, the importance of having unity. So thank you, Labour. So to talk about this specific topic, now Tafi also refers to we deal with true facts. So that's also my intention, to deal with true facts. Now, to talk about CPI, I do it at the backdrop of also the state of what the household of employees, the households of employees working in this industry are also facing comparing to the sector. So in other words, we're sitting with interest rates at the 14-year high. So in other words, the cost of borrowing is very high. High debt levels, if you look at the latest reports from APSA and Debt Rescue, and that's also as a result of some of the sacrifices workers had to make during COVID, et cetera, et cetera. So that is also the challenges the workers are facing. So So in this presentation, we will focus on CPI, but the importance here is to also to tell you, if we talk about CPI and inflation, we often use those two terms, as if it's the same. And today we want to show you what is actually what I will term, and I know Tafis will say it's not a scientific word, but it's what is worker inflation, what we actually, workers, your employees are actually experiencing. And it's also important to look at what workers are experiencing. There's inflation, but then there's also a rand value, a cost. So I want to show you also the importance of looking at both. So the thing is about CPI, so often when we start with opening demands, obviously there's an element of positional bargaining involved, but whenever there is an opening demand above CPI, you will find that journalists and the employers and whoever will interpret in such a way is that workers are not in touch with reality. So this presentation is to show you why actually if you get a CPI related increase, you're going to get poorer. Why we are pushing for above CPI, and obviously then we negotiate from there. So that's the one thing, is to say if you look at CPI, we look at the average, what the average of South African is experiencing, be it the CEO being a senior level or being at the lowest level, and the patterns differ. So in other words, if you talk about CPI, it's the best measurement we can use, but it's not accurate. And also CPI differs from province to province. So as we sit here, there are people from the Western Cape or from KwaZulu-Natal, obviously from Gauteng. So it differs also where your factory is and where your workers are from. So, and that's the whole idea, where what we have to do in terms of what your employees, what will be their interest financially. Obviously, we know about the balance between the sustainability of a business, but also the sustainability of a household. So we always aim to beat CPI or so-called inflation for the reasons that I want to explain here. Because if we don't do it, the following happens. First of all, it's literally, it goes for everybody that earns a salary. I think nearly everybody in this room, or maybe all of us, we are here because we have to work. As simple as that. We have to earn a salary, so we know our increases, if it's not inflation related, we're getting poorer. So that's the first thing. The CPI is a rough guide I referred to, and we also say it cannot be the only consideration that we're using. And then you will also see, if we got that basket, how you put CPI together, everything that goes into the basket, there are certain elements, weightings, that is absolutely irrelevant to what we experience from a worker point of view. So, and we also have it most of the time with workers living in rural areas, informal settlements, your outlying areas, and it goes actually for everybody. There's no substitute. There's specific costs. And if we look at also the third point about the bargaining power, so if you deal with electricity, food prices, the cost of data, fuel, also, as much as you as employers say we are price takers, obviously as a worker you're also a price taker. And then all of that impacting negatively on the workers, where also we will look at certain costs, the important ones about education and healthcare, where even you have less of bargaining power, because there are certain things you can go and buy cheaper food products, but healthcare and education is very important. So the following slides, this one just shows you that there is an upward trend. When you look at CPI, but the important part is to, first of all, as we stand here, and this presentation is just it's actually not a snapshot of the latest CPI figures as such. It is just an indication of how we interpret CPI. So it may sit at 5.1%, but now we look at the average. 6% for the previous year, in line with the increases of some of the workers received, but they are actually poorer now, because the increases date commence in 2021, when the average CPI was 6.9. So those workers that received 6% are already poorer, and based on the CPI interpretation from our side, but also obviously CPI being at 6.9 the previous the year before. So that again give you the indication about the headline inflation and the CPI excluding fuel, where you say that part excluding fuel, it keeps on staying above headline CPI. There's an upwards trend. There was a bit of a dip to 3, and then you will see there's an upwards trend. And this basically, there's the uncertainty. That is why the Reserve Bank most probably did not increase interest rates or decrease the repo rate for that uncertainty sitting there. So just at this point, to recap, what we are saying is that you cannot only use CPI for the reasons that I've mentioned. I'm not going to read through it because I've mentioned all of it. And then basically we say there's an increase in the cost of inflation, but that is actually a summary of what I've said up until now. Okay, so let's get to the basket. So the 2019, they've put the basket, they look at the basket again, and they say this is the new basket, but it might be difficult for you to see it, but you'll get a presentation. So if you look at that basket, first of all, it says, in terms of the weightings that used to put CPI together, we are spending 3.7% on the average household on electricity, which is obviously not the case. It's a lot more. Water and services, 3.6%. Then we look at, for instance, public transport. They said in terms of that basket, an employee that making use of public transport is only spending 2.4% of his income on public transport, which is clearly incorrect. You know, it's closer to 30 or 40% in some cases. Then we look at secondary, or let's look at tertiary education. 1%, you know, so you need to earn an extremely high salary, an exceptionally high salary, to only spend 1% of your salary on tertiary education. And the list goes on. So you get the message. So that's why we say, if we are so stuck in CPI, and if there's always the question, how can unions demand above CPI? That's the reason for it. So obviously we know inflation, there's a high inflation all over the world. We know inflation impacts on business as well, but understand our rationale. So basically what we're saying, you have your income, then it started to get eroded by inflation, you know, various expenses, and then there are all the hidden costs, medical, administered inflation and education inflation impacting on it. So just looked on medical aid. So you have to have medical aid or medical cover in most of the jobs that you're in this industry. So you end up looking first of all at inflation. It was very high since 2020. If you look at also the inflation, it's much on the medical side, much higher than CPI. So what we've been paying on the medical side, it's much higher. And this is just a graph showing you where health inflation lies, and then headline inflation. It's always higher and higher. But then you're also sitting with a situation where a Discovery or whoever can say we can only increase by 9%. But then you have shrinkflation, that basically then Discovery will go and they will reduce the savings component, they will take a lot of the benefits away, etc., etc. Now you need to have gap cover and all of those other kind of things. So the inflation or what you experience in terms of shrinkflation is a lot higher. Same thing with education. That figure of 6.1% for school fees, despite the fact that it's above CPI, that's not a true reflection, obviously, of what you have experienced now in January in terms of school fees. So maybe in 2 or 3 months' time, it will be a more accurate figure. And tertiary education, that 5.3% is already in question. So now you're sitting here with 8.7% food inflation. So 5.1% CPI. A lot of employers say, but you'll be pushing for CPI. The formal, the official stat says 8.7. And that's what we spend most on. But the thing is, obviously, look at 2022, what the increase of 6%. Workers were paying 10.7, but it was a lot higher. So And that's the same thing. The next graph will show you the blue bars are the increase in food prices. That's inflation. The red line will basically be food cost and rand value. And then you can see, just this massive increase in food costs. And I will give you a few examples of why that is. So then you've got food and non-alcoholic beverages. I'm very kind to this industry. When I do this presentation in the mining sector, I use the alcoholic beverages because it's a lot more valid and relevant there. But the thing is, so you can see that upward trend. That is what workers are experiencing. So to this point, to summarize, you may say journalists writing around the sector will say, but 5.1%. How can you demand above that? Then we start to unpack it. The average for 2023 was 6%, 2022, 6.9%. Then we look at inflation on specific food products, despite the 8.6 or 8.7% the previous years, going on 11%, 9%. But now you have to start breaking it down. So there's that thing, and we make the mistake, So we often negotiate and say, but you can't give a 6% for a worker earning 10,000 rand and comparing to somebody earning 100,000 rand, because first of all, rand value is a huge difference, and they both have to pay the same amount for a loaf of bread or for, in this case, for milk, eggs, and cheese. But that's actually not wrong. We are actually getting wrong as trade unions, because in Pietermaritzburg last week, there was a survey that showed that if you go to the outlying areas, you pay 50% more for instance, for eggs. General things that the normal household use, eggs and cheese. So that's really a lot higher. So you don't pay the same as the person earning 100,000, 200,000, etc., etc. You pay a lot more. So it's like a double whammy for those employees who does not have access to your retail, your retail stores that your normal Pick n Pay or Checkers, wherever. So food inflation is then a lot higher than the average food inflation. Then you can look at electricity costs. Maybe if we look at a sweetener, maybe you can throw in free electricity there when it comes to housing. But in the end, this is summarizing for you to give you the idea why CPI cannot be the only measurement. The same thing, if you look at all these factors, then if you look at, for instance, giving an increase on the minimums. That's why we, in the past, we were kicking against it, because now, first of all, you're giving a CPI-related increase, where CPI have already hopefully convinced you that CPI is not a true reflection of inflation, and then you put it on top of the minimum. So you can just see, the downward trend when it comes to what an employee is experiencing in terms of his or her income. Then just to get to this point, and I want to respond to what Tafi was saying, because I'm trying to give solutions to the employment and productivity decoupling. So I want to say there's a way of there can be a coupling. So we say the salary increase is not just a number, it's a catalyst for motivation and loyalty. Now to get back to that whole debate around decoupling between employment and productivity. Now, I know Lucio worked very closely with Dr. Franz Barker. He worked for the Chamber of Mines. It was the offices were just across the street from CIFSA, and we used to quote from this book, The South African Labor Market. It's one of the best books ever written in South Africa around labor economy. And he was the leading labor economist. And whenever we negotiated with him at the Chamber of Mines, we will pull out his book and quote from it. So he made a few changes to whatever he said. But now, Tafi, here's the solution to your problem. So first of all, what they said here, they referred to something called, they said, wage increases can lead to an equivalent productivity increase. That is called efficiency wage. So in other words, now we're dealing with your decoupling concern. So then Ehrenberg and Smith and McDonald, together with Dr. Barker, there was their research, and they came to the following, that higher wages can result in at least an equivalent increase in productivity. That is called efficiency wage. So in other words, what they're saying, if you want a 10% increase in production, you do a 10% increase on salaries, simple as that. But something goes with it. They say, but now, why is it that if you pay, what did their research come to? Why did they say that if there's a higher percentage increase, there's higher productivity? They said the following will happen. First of all, you attract a better quality worker. A higher wage means also, and they've done research, and those employers that pays above what the prescribed minimum wage is, they found that those employers are also the ones that invest more in training. So first of all, they pay higher, they invest more in training, you have a more productive workforce. But then they say a higher salary increases the workers' morale, increases, or there's a decrease in the rates of absenteeism, because the workers, obviously, there's an opportunity cost, you don't want to lose it, but workers can afford better quality food. So you have workers' nutritional value and the health levels start to improve, and it all have a positive impact. And in the end, there's whole research on it, but I'll share it with you if need be. But now the last thing, again, workers are getting blamed for a lot of things, but also if you get to the point where you sit with, but you pay higher wages, but there's no improvement in production, maybe, and to end off with, in this book, there was also research conducted by the Labour Market Commission, and they found, and they said, our research found that a lack of management skills in leadership, mentoring, work reorganization, decision-making abilities is a major constraint on productivity improvement. Many of the factors that influence productivity can be found in the organization itself and largely influenced by poor management. So I think I've given you also, prior to lunch, food for thought in that regard. But then lastly, to end off, so and when we get to the wage negotiations, and if we get to the part where we go down the avenue of the sweetener, we will use these kind of graphs comparing to other industries, but this one is just, we're looking at average salaries in South Africa, we plot it against the manufacturing industry, and then you see that's well below. So in other words, the message here is that the workers are not overpaid in that sector, but these are just where we got our stats from. But I want to end off and see what positives can we get out of the industry. Are there any positives, anything that we can look at? And I'm going to be very brief, But first of all, there are developments at ArcelorMittal. So Irvin is also very involved, together with the leadership of Solidarity, with negotiations. There's a lot happening behind the scenes. So yeah, let's just wait and see, what that outcome might be, but it might not be worst case scenario that we're expecting. Then if we look at MIPFA stats, you will see there's growth in membership and growth in contributions, but on the negative side, there were arrear payments, but there's a massive improvement over the past few months in arrear contributions coming in, certain employers making double payments. So at least into a way that shows you it's not all doom and gloom. These are positive signs. What sits behind it is obviously a lot of analysis that you could do, but there are positive signs. And yes, there are companies within the industry that's under pressure, but then you also have companies that are doing relatively well, that still falls within the scope of the MEIBC. If we look at companies like Cape Gate, and if you look at Wire Force, but also your other companies, Columbus Steel, we look at South 32, we look at, that's the Hillside, what I'm referring to, Samancor. So there are also companies under these difficult circumstances who can make it work, are doing well. So, program director, so the message is that, first of all, If we push for above CPI, you will know and understand why. And secondly, it's not all doom and gloom in this industry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gideon. I'm looking for hands, both inside and virtually. I've got Wasa at the back. Any other hand? One hand, Wasa at the back. Thank you so much.
Hello? Yes. Thank you again, Program Director. I'm sorry to be a nuisance, but I'm beginning to see positives in the presentation. And I'm saying that WASA is unofficially, but we'll make it official later, unofficially supporting the what was tabled by the General Secretary of NUMSA and the General Secretary of Solidarity. So we aligned with that. And I'm happy that the General Secretary of Solidarity is negating what Mr. from Taffy gave earlier on the state of economy and inflationary pressures. So I'm saying that as WASA, we are really supporting. And I hope that SIFSA and NIASA and others are listening, because really, I don't think we are going to really negate what has been said now. Thank you.
WASA will consider that a comment, not a question. So we can release Mr. Du Plessis. Thank you so much. Give a hand of applause. Thank you, thank you. Now we are at the tail end. The GS is approaching me. I have a duty to give him a hearing. Yeah. Thank you. It's very important information to say that lunch that was scheduled for 12:30 is still available, despite. The venue name is Galleria North. Out of the door, and you turn left. So I assume when you sit now looking this way, so you look that way, out of the door, then you turn left and you look for a name of a place called Galleria North. That will be the place where lunch will be served. That's one. Two, time now, ladies and gentlemen, time now is 41 minutes to 1. Can we reconvene here at 1:45 to proceed with the next session of the of today's engagement? The thing on the agenda says is a closed discussion. My understanding, therefore, is that a closed discussion is only for people that are parties to that situation. So in other words, if you're not part of the industry, then you are thanked and you are released. In social media, I know that there are people that are called content creators. I saw some colleagues from the media here, that if by any chance you are here at 1:45, then please don't create further content on any discussions that are here. With those few words, thank you so much. We'll see you after lunch. Thank you.
No, don't Table.